All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most influential and honestly one of the most controversial political thinkers of the 20th century, a man named Leo Strauss. His work has shaped entire generations of scholars, and it's been connected, whether that's fair or not, to some major political movements, especially neoconservatism. He's one of those figures who inspires either total devotion or really deep suspicion. There's not much middle ground. So, beyond all that controversy, what was actually at the core of his thought? That's what we're going to try and unpack today. And this quote right here from an interview he gave, it really gets to the absolute heart of his entire project. For Strauss, philosophy wasn't some safe academic exercise. No, it was a risky, totally essential challenge to the way things are. Okay, so let's get into it. Strauss's whole body of work really starts with a diagnosis. He looked out at the modern world and he saw a society in a state of pretty profound crisis. He basically believed that the West, starting somewhere around the time of Machiavelli, just took a sharp turn and broke away from its classical and religious roots. In its big rush for progress and scientific certainty, he argued it had just forgotten the most important questions, questions about morality and what it means to live a good life. And this break, he said, led to what he called the great diseases of modern thought. First up, you've got nihilism, the belief that there are no real values. Then, relativism and historicism. These are the ideas that truth is just a product of your time and place. And finally, scientism, the belief that only scientific facts can be considered true knowledge, which kind of dismisses all those big questions about morality as just mere opinion. And this, for Strauss, is the ultimate price we pay. When a society decides that all values are subjective, it completely loses the ability to have a serious conversation about justice. All it can talk about is what's efficient or what's stable, but not about what is truly right. He really pointed his finger at the modern university, specifically at something he called value-free social science. He argued that this whole idea of studying politics without making judgments about good and bad was a total delusion. He said it doesn't get rid of values at all. It just smuggles in its own unexamined ones, like always preferring stability over justice or individual liberty over human excellence. So if modernity was in crisis, where do you even start to look for a cure? Well, for Strauss, the answer wasn't to push forward into something new. It was to look back, way back, to the wisdom of the past. He really advocated for a return to the great thinkers, people like Plato, Aristotle, Maimonides. And the goal wasn't necessarily to find easy answers for today's problems. It was about recovering the fundamental questions about human nature and the best way to live together, questions he believed modernity had just forgotten how to even ask. And this contrast is absolutely key to understanding Strauss. The ancients, he said, were all about virtue and excellence. Their big question was, what is the good life for a human being? But the moderns, they lowered the goalposts. They focused on more practical stuff, like security and liberty, asking not what is best, but what is most stable or most efficient. In his view, philosophy went from being a guide for how to live well to just being a tool for mastering nature and controlling society. Okay, so this brings us to Strauss's most famous and definitely his most controversial idea, this notion that the great philosophers of the past didn't always say what they meant, at least not directly, that they often wrote in a kind of code. He called this esoteric writing. The idea is basically that a philosophical text has layers. On the surface, you have the exoteric teaching, which is safe, conventional, and totally acceptable to the society it was written in. But hidden, between the lines, is the esoteric teaching. This is the philosopher's true, often radical set of thoughts, and it's intended only for a handful of really careful and perceptive readers. So why on earth would you do this? Well, Strauss laid out a few big reasons. First, to protect the philosopher. Questioning a society's most deeply held beliefs is dangerous business, just as Socrates, right? Second, and this is a really fascinating twist, it was to protect the society from philosophy. Constant, radical questioning can dissolve the shared beliefs that hold a community together. And finally, it works like a filter. It attracts the few readers who are serious enough to dig for the truth while pushing away those who might just misunderstand or misuse it. So what great secrets did Strauss think this special way of reading unlocked? Well, it wasn't a single, simple truth. It was something much more profound, a great, permanent tension that sits right at the heart of Western civilization. He argued that when you read the classics this carefully, you discover they are all wrestling with the same fundamental conflict. A conflict that, in his view, pretty much defines the human condition. And this is the core conflict right here. On one side, you have Athens, representing the life of reason, of philosophy, of relentless questioning. On the other side, you have Jerusalem, the life of revelation, of faith, of obedience to divine law. For Strauss, these two pillars of the West could never truly be combined or reconciled. He believed you had to choose, and that the tension between them is the very thing that gives our civilization its energy and its dynamism. So, as you can probably imagine, these ideas about a crisis in modernity, secret codes in books, and these huge unresolvable tensions, they've left behind a very complex and, let's say, contested legacy. I mean, his influence is just undeniable. It stretches from the halls of universities right into the corridors of political power. But what that influence actually is, well, that's the subject of some really fierce debate. So on one hand, he created this powerful school of thought that completely revitalized the study of the great books. But on the other hand, critics accuse him of being an elitist. They argue that this whole distinction between the few wise readers and the many promotes a kind of anti-democratic worldview. And his ideas have been controversially tied to neoconservatism, especially this idea, which he got from Plato, that leaders sometimes have to use noble lies, convenient fictions basically, to govern the masses for the greater good. Now, his defenders push back hard against all this. They'll point out that Strauss himself was never politically active and was actually really skeptical of trying to apply philosophy directly to modern problems. His real goal, they argue, was to protect the space for independent thought, for philosophy, from being co-opted or controlled by politics. And they'll say he was an equal opportunity critic of both the modern left and the modern right. So I think the crucial point is this. Whatever you think of his legacy, Strauss forces us to go back to the most basic questions. He insists that you can't understand politics just by looking at data and processes. You have to ask the big, uncomfortable questions about justice, about virtue, and about what kind of society truly deserves our loyalty. And that really leaves us with a final, very Straussian question, adapted from his own writings. He reminds us that the easy, comfortable answers are rarely the true ones, and that maybe the health of a society can be measured by how willing it is to tolerate the very questions that make it the most uncomfortable.